Chapter 7. Wake up, Frankie. I want to go home. Francis awoke stiff and tired as Petey buried his face in her neck, whimpering, I want Ma. I want Ma too. Are we ever going to see Ma again? Peg wailed. There now, Francis soothed. Of course we are. But she kept her eyes downcast, unable to meet theirs. How could she tell them this when she didn't believe it herself? Every turn of the train's wheels took them farther and farther away from Ma. Francis tried to smile to bolster their spirits because she was in charge. The others mustn't know she felt like crying too. Francis looked up, feeling Megan's appraising eyes upon her. Megan brushed back her long dark hair and whispered, What will happen to us, Frankie? Why, we'll find good homes. We'll have new families, good food, warm beds, Francis parroted. She reached across Petey and gripped her sister's hand. Oh, Megan, she whispered, I honestly don't know what will happen. One of the younger boys fell in the aisle and let out a yell. At the sound of it, another child began to cry. Can't someone shut those urchins up? Mr. Crandon bellowed as the train lurched into motion. They're only children, a woman snapped at. Mr. Crandon puffed up like a pigeon guarding the only crumb of bread. Madam, we are entitled to as much peace and quiet as the railroad company can provide. I'm sorry. Andrew raised his voice over the din. We'll feed the children at the next stop, and I can guarantee that'll help the situation. Well, if you can't control them, Mr. Crandon began, but Mike suddenly jumped into the aisle and shouted to the older children, Hey there, chums. How about a bit of music? He cupped his hands together and held them to his lips, creating a lively nasal music as he hummed, and to the music he danced a few wild steps of a jig. The children who were crying stopped to stare and broke into laughter as Mike leaped to click his heels together, lost his balance, and sprawled in the aisle. Francis saw the twinkle in Mike's eyes and knew he had taken to the fall on purpose. More, more, Petey shouted. So Mike pranced and danced to his odd music, and when some of the older children recognized the tune, they joined in singing the words Francis knew, the Irish washerwoman and old dog Tray, and when Mike began Old Susanna, some of the adults in the car began to sing too, and Captain Taylor's deep baritone as loud as Andrew's. Suddenly, with a jolt that tossed Mike sideways into Catherine's lap, the train shook and rolled to a screeching stop. Good work, Catherine murmured to Mike as she helped him regain his balance. Captain Taylor stretched forward to shake Mike's hand and said, A wise choice of action, son. Francis was proud of Mike. He'd been able to make them all forget their aches and fears. Ma would have been proud of Mike, too, if she could have seen him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a frantic cry of fire. The conductor threw open the door of the passenger car. Sparks from the train set a brush fire, he shouted. All able-bodied males are needed to help put it out. Come on, Mike grabbed Francis's arm and tugged her into the aisle. All able-bodied males, he wickedly muttered under his breath, means you too. Don't be frightened, boys. Andrew stopped Francis with a firm grip on her shoulder and handed her a wet feed sack as she leapt from the railroad car. It's not uncommon for sparks to set small brush fires. Just take the sack and join the others. Deep orange scarlet flames curled and crackled through the burning grass. The yellow smoke rose in choking clouds. Most of the men and boys poured from the train, grabbed the wet sacks, and were slapping them at the smoldering grass. Francis, hands shaking with terror, copied their actions, working hard, slamming her dripping sack on the flames, dipping it over and over into the bucket, slamming it down again. She was soon absorbed in beating back the low spurts of flame. Look out, you're on fire! Francis jumped, but it was Amos Crandon Mike meant. Mr. Crandon froze with fear as the back of his shirt tail burst into flame. Your shirt, man! Pull it off! Andrew shouted and began to run toward Mr. Crandon. But Mike was faster. He dove toward the back of Mr. Crandon's knees. Mr. Crandon bent in two and fell over Mike, sitting down hard. Mike scrambled on top of the man and pushed him on his back, rolling him over and flinging himself across him. Mike sat up, examining the scorched shirt. Fire's out, he announced happily. Mr. Crandon angrily sputtered. How dare you push me to the ground? You ought to be whipped. Francis wanted to defend Mike, but was too furious to do anything but sputter. She was glad that Andrew seemed surprised as Mike by Mr. Crandon's outburst. She caught her breath as Andrew spoke up. Your shirt was on fire, and Mike put it out to keep you from getting burned. Mr. Crandon glared at Andrew. He brushed the dirt from his clothes and muttered to himself, unaware of two large spots of very pink skin were showing through the holes in his trousers, and stomped onto the train. Andrew patted Mike's shoulder, and Francis said, He did the right thing, Mike, but it wasn't at Mike she was looking. Andrew was a fine man, a really good and kind man like Dot. Oh, how Francis yearned to be called Francis Mary again. On board, everybody, the conductor yelled as he collected the dirty, charred feed sacks. Fire's out. Get back on board. We can get underway. After this train ride's over, Mike muttered to Francis as they climbed aboard the steps of the car. I hope I never see old Crandon again. The train rattled its way west, stopping every 25 miles or so for water and wood. Francis gazed dreamily out the open hills, the dim forests, the squares of farmland, the rippling gray-gold grasslands. The train crossed trestles and bridges and passed towns that began to look alike to Francis. Occasionally she'd begin to wonder if it was this type of farm or that kind of house that she would be like the one in which she would live. Sometimes she would just sit back, her arm around Petey, and let herself be rocked by the steady rhythm of the rackety wheels that clattered over and over. New life, new life, new life. I want a new life, Francis murmured to herself. Mike and I are going to be together, Danny came to tell Frances. Terror showed in his eyes, though, and Frances said what she knew he wanted to hear. There's a very good chance you will be. The people who adopt the children, are most of them kind, do you think? Megan whispered so softly that Frances could hardly hear her. I'm sure they are, Frances said. Why else would they come? It's a good question, Mike said, and I haven't worked out the answer to it yet. Why would anyone want us? Frances put on a brave face and even managed to laugh, because we're a fine lot, we are, and those who get us will be lucky, that's why. For a moment they were content, but Frances's heart ached as she realized the words meant nothing. If she was only saying what they wanted to hear, how was that what Catherine and Andrew were doing as well? Days and nights and nights. Days became nights, and nights broke into early daylights, with passengers so stiff they grimaced as they stretched their legs and rubbed their arms and neck. The children and other passengers dozed, ate, and talked. Occasionally, conversation in the car grew lively, especially when the topic turned to politics and the pros and cons of slavery. Frances listened and soaked up the words that somewhat echoed what Dodd told her. The children changed to another train in the massive Chicago Railroad station. This one would take them to the Mississippi River, which they'd cross over, heading toward Hannibal, Missouri. Frances would be glad to see the long trade ride end, where her hands grew damp, and she found it hard to breathe wherever she thought might await her and her brothers and sisters in St. Joseph. The car in which they rode southwest toward Hannibal looked very much the same as the first one. Outside the city, even the farms and houses looked like they had seen for so many days, and most of the passengers on the car were the same. Frances knew that everyone was exhausted as she was, even the adults. She remembered the flounces and parasols, the grand top hats the ladies and gentlemen wore as they got on the first train in Albany, and now their once elegant suit coats and wide bustle dresses were wilted and dusty. And Petey put his mouth to Frances's ear and whispered, "Some of these people stink." Frances could only nod in agreement. Mike and another boy got in a shoving match in the aisle, and Frances found herself scolding Mike with an overly sharp tongue. Mike snapped back rudely, sticking out his tongue, and it was all she could do not to slap him. Arguments exploded among the children as quickly and as often as sparks from the burning, sap-filled log tousled and rumpled. Peg and Danny poked at each other unmercifully, and Petey cried even at the smallest little thing. Even Megan, who was usually gentle and even-tempered, held in a miserable heap next to the window. Early one evening they reached the broad Mississippi River, which they would cross by steamboat. Standing with the others who clustered at the rail of the big paddle wheeler, Frances begged, "Please, can we stay outside to watch?" "It's cold and damp," Catherine said. She touched Frances's cheek. "You're going to get soaked by the mist rising from the water." "I don't mind," Frances said. "It's a big river and so many boats." Jim stepped up beside her. "Please," he echoed. We want to see it all." Catherine laughingly agreed, but most of the other children ran up and down the deck. Jim pointed out some of the types of boats to Frances. "I want to work on a boat," he said. "Maybe one of those big steamboats with twin stacks." His voice filled with yearning, and he added, "Maybe a captain and his wife will adopt me." He continued to lean over the rail, eagerly studying the heavy river traffic, but Frances soon lost interest in the boats and kept an eye on the Missouri shore ahead, watching it appear from the mists as it grew nearer. When they arrived in Hannibal, Missouri, many passengers left to journey to St. Louis, and other passengers joined them on a third train. "We're actually in Missouri," Frances thought, and she couldn't eat another bite of food that Andrew had brought on board for their supper. Although Danny gobbled down his meal and Mike's appetite seemed to have disappeared too, Frances glanced at Mike just as he looked at her, and she knew that he shared her terror at what they might have to face when they reached St. Joseph. "Frances," he said, and then quickly corrected himself. "Frankie, I'm sorry about all this. I know you being sent west has been awful hard on you with how close you and Ma were." Frances shook her head. "We don't have to talk about it, but I want to, because it's my fault that the rest of you are all here, and I'm sorry I did this to you." "Oh, Mike." Frances reached to touch her brother's hand. "I don't blame you." She tried to make her voice light. "Look at it this way. You kept telling me I'd like living in the West, and now I'll have the chance to find out if you're right." Mike didn't respond to her attempt at humor. "This is our last time to be together, and after we're placed, who knows when we'll see each other again. We may not know when we'll be together again, but I'm sure we will be. I'll write to you. Will you write me back?" Mike nodded. "Sure, and someday." But the train squealed with such a sudden stop that they were all thrown off balance. "Outlaws!" a woman screamed as a heavily bearded man burst through the doors of their car, waving a rifle at the passengers. Shrieks and yells came from the other cars as men on horseback galloped at each side of the train. One of the men reined in his horse and poked a long gun through the open windows of the children's car. A bearded man waved a small sackcloth at the passengers. "Sit down right now, all ya, and don't you do anything I'll tell you to do," he snapped. As she dropped down onto the bench, Frances saw Captain Taylor glance at the man on horseback outside the window and back at the outlaw in the aisle. She held her breath, wondering what he would do, but he sat quietly and kept his hand away from the satchel and his gun. "Everybody pay attention," the outlaw demanded, little drops of spittle glittering on his beard. "Put your money and your valuables in the sack." And when they were slow to react, he yelled, "Now, and jabbed the end of his rifle at Mr. Crandon's stomach. "Don't do that," Mr. Crandon squeaked. I'll give you my money. See, here it is." He fumbled for a wad of bills out of a gleaming gold money clip and dropped it into the sack. The outlaw moved up the aisle, thrusting the open sack ahead of him, his nervous eyes darting from one passenger to another. One by one, the passengers obeyed as the outlaw eyed them closely. The women even took off their rings and bracelets and dropped them into the sack. Some of the men gave up their pocket watches. As the outlaw came forward, Catherine came to Catherine. She said, "I have no money." He glanced at her hand. "You have a ring? Take it off." "Oh, please let me keep it," Catherine said. Frances was amazed to see tears in her eyes. "It's not of much value, but it does mean a great deal to me." The man quickly glanced at the man on horseback back at Catherine. His voice grew even more loud and harsh. "You heard me. Drop it in the sack. Now." As Catherine obeyed, the outlaw outside the window called, "Get a move on. We're ready to ride." Cautiously, his gun being held before him, the bearded outlaw began to back away from the passengers. Suddenly Mike was in the aisle, plowing into the man, and they stumbled together as the cloth bag was almost jerked from the outlaw's hand. Angrily, the man regained his balance, giving Mike such a hard clout with his left hand that he knocked him sprawling. Mike bounced off the edge of the nearest seat and landed on the floor of the car, curled face down, not moving. Frances gasped and rushed toward Mike as the outlaw jumped from the car. She could hear more yelling and the sound of galloping horses as he and the rest of the gang raced away from the train. The sound of gunshots exploded outside the window, and Captain Taylor shouted, "Got one of them! Just in the shoulder, blast it!" "Mike, wake up!" Frances begged as she threw her arms around him. Danny dove in next to her, and the next minute Andrew and Catherine were beside her as well, ready to help. But Mike squirmed away from Frances and struggled to his knees and stood up, one fist clenched against his chest. Frances scrambled to her feet too, trying once more to put her arm around her brother. "Oh, Mike, are you hurt?" Mike pulled away to face the other staring passengers. Frances could see him try a smile. The tears filled his eyes. "I was a copper stealer once." Mike's voice was barely a whisper. "I promised Ma, I promised myself I'd never pick pockets again. But I couldn't let that outlaw take Mrs. Banks' ring, not when it meant so much to her." He held out an open fist and dropped the ring into Catherine's hand. "Oh," Catherine gasped. "Oh, Mike." She held the ring up to stare at it as though she couldn't believe it was really there, and tears came to her eyes too. Quickly she bent to wrap Mike in a hug. Around them people murmured, "How did he manage to do that? What'd the boy do?" "There's more," Mike mumbled against Catherine's hand and shoulder, and she stepped back and he held out his hand, palm up, and opened his fingers. In it lay a wad of bills. As everyone stared, Mike gave the lot to Andrew. "I couldn't get it all," he apologized, "but maybe those who lost their money could divide this." Good. Mr. Crandon stretched to see and then scowled. "What's this? What about me? He didn't retrieve my gold money clip." One of the women began to chirp like a frightened bird. "The bag will be almost empty. What if the outlaw notices and comes back?" Mike shook his head. "He won't notice. I dropped my book in the bag to give it weight." He managed a shaky grin. "Tales in those novels about brave, daring outlaws were wrong. There wasn't anything grand about that man. He was dirty and fat and smelled like a New York gutter in the summer." Catherine put an arm around Mike's shoulder and hugged him. "You risked your life," she said. "You shouldn't have done that." As Mike ducked his head, Catherine slipped the ring back on her finger and added quickly, "But oh, Mike, my friend, I thank you with all my heart that you retrieved my ring." Captain Taylor stepped forward to shake Mike's hand. "You exhibited great courage," he said. "I'm proud of you." Mr. Crandon's booming voice almost drowned out the captain's words. "You all heard the boy. He admitted to being a copper stealer, common pickpocket." "Now just a minute, Mr. Crandon," Catherine said. "This is the boy who saved your life during the fire." But Mr. Crandon sparked. "Saved my life? That's debatable. All I know is he ruined my trousers." "You're not being fair to Mike. He risked his life with that outlaw to try to save some of our property." "He tried to help," Danny echoed as he stepped in front of Mike. Mr. Crandon wrinkled his nose as though he just smelled something bad. "Granted, the boy thought he was doing right," he said. "I'll give you that much. But don't you see, it simply proves my point. He's never learned the right values." "That's not true," Frances exclaimed, but Mr. Crandon ignored her. "A boy like that should not be allowed in a proper home, and I'll do my best to see he isn't." "Mr. Crandon," Andrew began, but a woman who had boarded the train at Hannibal raised her voice to shout over his. "I agree. Perhaps the boy could just be sent back to New York." Her companion clutched the lapels of her jacket together as though Mike had plans to steal it, and stammered, "I think Mr. Crandon should have steps to see it's done. We don't need a New York City pickpocket here." "No." Frances could stay quiet no longer. She stepped in front of Mike and faced the surprised passengers. "In New York," she said, "we worked very hard, but we didn't always have enough to eat. And we didn't have clean, fine clothes like the ones we're wearing now. And we didn't have our father. Da died last year. Mike was wrong to steal, but he thought he had to do it so he could bring home a bit of meat now and then. He tried in his own way to help." She took a long, deep breath and hurried on before she could lose what little courage she had left. "We're people, just like you, and we have the same feelings you have." A woman who earlier had spoken up for the children held out a hand as though she were reaching for Frances and said, "Oh, my dear child, it's plain some of us have forgotten you have no parents to guide you." "We have a parent. We have a mother," Frances said, "and she and Dad taught us over and over again the rules we should follow." "You have a mother? Well, But where is she? Frances held her chin up, willing to stop trembling. She sent us west, she said, trying to repeat Ma's words without thinking about them, because she wanted us to have better lives than she could give us. Without another word, the passengers drifted back to their seats. The children, subdued and silent now, sat clustered on the benches. Andrew squeezed into the seat next to Frances. Well spoken, he said. I think you and Mike are going to do very well for yourselves in the West. Frances glanced back at Mr. Crandon. She couldn't help feeling afraid, not just for Mike, but for all of them. Every minute was taking them closer to St. Joseph, to a place she'd never seen that might be her home for the rest of her life. What would happen to them then?